Chapter 1. Maggie. The heat outside was preposterous, utterly unreasonable, downright inhumane. It felt like the inside of a mouth. In the 5 minutes it took me to haul my suitcases into my rental house from my leased car, I'd sweated through my shirt. I had to stick maxi pads inside my bra and starfish under a ceiling fan for 15 minutes to recover. Welcome to Texas. It wasn't as if I'd never experienced summer in the South before, but it had been long enough that I'd forgotten how punishing it was, how it made my brain fog, my limbs heavy, and my northern blood sluggish in my veins. How did people function under these conditions? Humans had no business living here. It was a perimenopausal woman's worst nightmare. Even during our worst summers, we'd never had heat this intense where I'd grown up. Fun fact, Buffalo, New York was one of only a few cities in America that had never officially recorded 3-digit temperatures. According to my weather app, the temperature in Crowder, Texas, right now was only 93. But it was expected to break 105 later this afternoon. What in the blasted hellscape? Accounting for humidity, the heat index would be 112 degrees. And that was in the shade. God knew what it would feel like if you were suicidal enough to be standing in the sun. I imagined squirrels bursting into flames on rooftops, streets turning to rivers of molten asphalt, and swimming pools boiling people alive. Perhaps I was being the teeniest bit overdramatic, but cheese and crackers, it was hot. What I wouldn't give for a nice snowdrift to plunge myself into right about now. If this contract hadn't been so lucrative, I never would have let myself be lured to Texas in August. Thank the gods above for air conditioning. More specifically, thank God the air conditioning in my rental house seemed to be holding its own against the weather outside. When you rented online, you never knew quite what you were going to get. Those well-framed photos that realtors and property owners posted could be diabolically deceptive. I'd been burned more than once over the years, and was used to making do with all sorts of unsatisfactory living situations. But a faulty air conditioner would be a trial I didn't want to deal with in this kind of weather. My consulting business required me to travel wherever my client companies happened to be located. Sometimes I'd only need to be on site for a few days or weeks, and sometimes I'd be in my temporary lodgings for months on end. Over the last 8 years, I'd done time in all manner of short-term leases and extended stay hotels, from the luxurious to the horrific, and everything in between. At this point, I'd pretty much seen it all. Whatever life handed me, I could deal with it, even this ungodly heat. The new contract I'd taken on would likely keep me here for the next 6 months, so I was relieved to find my rental house hadn't presented me with any unpleasant surprises. None that were apparent yet, anyway. My options had been limited in a town of this size. This wasn't Manhattan or Minneapolis, or even Mobile, Alabama. Crowder was a rural community 70 miles from Austin, in a county with only one hospital and more cows than people. The 2-bedroom house I'd rented sat on a large lot in a quiet neighborhood 5 minutes from the office, where I'd be working as of Monday. The house had been recently updated with fresh paint, new countertops, and modern appliances, and even had a detached garage to protect my car from the sun and elements. Most importantly, the air conditioner seemed to be aces, which would be crucial in the punishing heat of a central Texas summer. Amazingly, my next-door neighbor appeared unfazed by the heat outside. As I stood at my kitchen sink getting a drink of water, I could see him through the window, pushing a lawnmower across his backyard. To each his own, I supposed. Maybe he was used to it, living here. At least he was wearing a straw cowboy hat and long sleeves to protect him from the sun. From what I could see of him, he appeared to be an extraordinarily large man. It was hard to estimate height from a distance, but I'd put him well over 6 feet. He was broad as well as tall, barrel-chested with thick arms and even thicker legs, and carried himself with the posture and grace of an athlete. Given his size and the fact we were in Texas, my money was on football. A former college player, perhaps. Our backyards were separated by a low chain-link fence, which afforded an unobstructed view of his property from my kitchen window. His house looked to be a mirror image of mine in its layout, down to the detached garage that sat at the near back corner in his lot next to mine. Our driveways ran in parallel between our 2 houses, with only the fence and a narrow strip of grass separating them. His kitchen window faced directly onto mine, but was mostly obstructed by many blinds and the big silver pickup truck parked in his driveway. His garage door was currently raised, however, displaying an impressive collection of weights and gym equipment inside. If he exercised in an unair-conditioned garage during the summer, I could only assume the man must have some sort of superhuman immunity to extreme heat. As I watched him march back and forth across the length of his yard, I could see sweat stains darkening the fabric of his shirt. But otherwise, he showed no signs of fatigue or discomfort. Definitely superhuman. Realizing I'd been staring at the man through my window for several minutes, I dragged my attention away. Fascinating as my neighbor's lawn maintenance efforts were, I had work to do. My new client had couriered over a laptop this morning, granting me full access to all their financial, HR, and internal communication systems. By Monday morning, I needed to know everything there was to know about how the company spent its money, so I'd be ready to hit the ground running. I sat down at the dining room table with the new laptop and didn't think about my neighbor again until much, much later that night. While I was adjusting to a new place, I always had difficulty sleeping. Predictably, the anticipation of starting a new job conspired with the strange bed and even stranger wildlife sounds outside to keep me awake. After several hours of fruitless tossing and turning, I got up and wandered aimlessly around the unfamiliar house. When my ramblings brought me to the kitchen, my attention was immediately drawn to the window, more specifically to the light pouring out of my neighbor's open garage. He must be either a night owl or a fellow insomniac, because he was not only awake, but exercising. Shirtless. He wasn't simply big, he was built. Tremendously built. The man had muscles stacked on top of muscles, all of them bulging and flexing as he did dips in his squat rack. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Those triceps, those back muscles, that ass. My God, his ass. It looked like someone had stuffed 2 basketballs inside the thin, clingy workout shorts that hung tantalizingly low on his powerful hips. What an unexpected gift. If they'd included a photo of this view in the rental listing for my house, they could have charged several $100s more, maybe even $1,000. Was it wrong to stand here watching a stranger through my window like this? It felt vaguely naughty, but it wasn't as though I was invading his privacy. Not really. He was out in plain sight with his garage door wide open. In the surrounding darkness, the bright overhead light illuminating his every move might as well be a spotlight shining on a stage. He had to know people would be able to see him. Was I supposed to be ashamed of looking out my own window at whatever happened to be there for me to see? Wrong or not, I was helpless to do anything but stare, captivated, as he wrenched his massive body up and down, in a rhythm so hypnotizing I found myself counting along with his reps under my breath. How could he possibly keep it up for so long? And yet, he did. He kept going like some sort of machine, his muscles straining and limbs shaking as he pushed himself to the breaking point. Imagine being that strong, having that much power and vitality. It poured off him in waves I swore I could feel even from the safety of my kitchen. Truly, the man was a marvel of nature. Genetically blessed, certainly. But the level of control he exerted over himself, the self-discipline it must have taken to achieve this sort of perfection, was even more impressive than his God-given gifts. It almost felt like he was punishing himself. Either that or he was training for the Olympic dips team. Honestly, why wasn't there an Olympic dips team? I'd watch the hell out of that event. There ought to be a channel where you could watch beefy, shirtless men doing dips 24 hours a day. Finally, after an inconceivable number of reps, his giant, quivering arms gave out on him. He dropped to the floor, chest heaving as sweat dripped off his skin. When he grabbed a towel off the rack to dry his face and neck, I reached and touched my mouth to make sure I wasn't drooling. That was the moment he finally turned around. I didn't know if he could see me standing in my dark kitchen, but I wasn't willing to take the chance. Spinning away from the window, I lurched sideways until I was safely plastered against the wall, out of his view. Feeling naughtier than ever, I sucked in an unsteady breath as my pulse pounded in my ears. Had I been caught? God, I hoped not. Even if I hadn't technically done anything wrong, I certainly didn't want my new neighbor to know I'd been watching him. When I got up the next morning, my extraordinarily attractive neighbor was outside working on his yard again. This time, I only allowed myself a brief glance through the kitchen window. Enough of a look to see that he was once more covered up by a hat and long sleeves as he attacked the edges of his driveway with a weed whacker. He had surely gotten even less sleep than me. How did he have so much energy for yard work after that late-night workout? All I'd done was watch, and I still felt oddly drained by the experience. Though that might have something to do with the vivid, X-rated dream I'd had after I finally fell asleep last night. Featuring my hot neighbor, of course. I'd barely even seen the man's face, but my imagination seemed to have no trouble filling in the blanks. My cheeks flushed, remembering how I'd awakened with my heart pounding, and the fading pulse of an orgasm vibrating through my limbs. I continued to hear him outside over the next several hours, wielding various instruments of serenity-defiling ear torture, but I resisted the urge to look out the window again. The noise eventually stopped, and when I ventured out to the grocery store around noon, my neighbor was nowhere to be seen. Nor was he around when I returned home an hour later, dripping with sweat from my brief trek across the grocery store parking lot and the short drive home in a roasting hot car. As I lugged my groceries inside, I was simultaneously relieved and disappointed not to have encountered him. I had no interest in getting to know my neighbors, not even the hot ones, and I definitely wasn't eager to introduce myself to the stranger I'd had an explicit sex dream about. And yet I couldn't help longing for another hit of the dopamine the sight of him provided. At the very least, a better look at the man's face wouldn't be unwelcome. That night, once again, I had trouble falling asleep. Tomorrow would be my first day at the client site, and I had a lot on my mind. In particular, my meeting with the entire senior management team first thing in the morning. It was important I make a strong impression right off the bat to set a tone for our relationship going forward. I certainly wasn't thinking about my neighbor at all. All right, maybe I was thinking about him a little. As I lay under the ceiling fan tossing and turning, I couldn't help wondering if he was out in his garage at that very moment. Did he work out every night at the same time? I was dying to know. Eventually, my curiosity drove me from my bed. As I padded into the kitchen, my heart sped up at the telltale glow of light pouring through the kitchen window. He was out there again, shirtless like last night, but this time he was facing outward, toward the open doorway of his garage. I hung back, trying to keep to the shadows in case he happened to glance at my window. He was doing bicep curls with a pair of enormous hexagonal dumbbells, alternating one arm with the other in slow, precisely controlled movements. Although his veiny biceps and chest were surely an impressive sight to behold, I was most excited to finally have a clear view of his face. His mouth was set in an intimidating grimace of exertion, white teeth bared behind tightly drawn lips. Beneath a thick shock of copper-colored hair, his strong brow was lined by deep furrows of concentration, and his long, angular jaw covered with matching reddish-brown stubble. It surprised me to realize he was a redhead. I'd been so distracted by his body last night I hadn't even noticed his hair color, though surely it must have been as obvious then as it was now. No wonder he covered up when he was out in the sun. His fair, freckled skin would be particularly susceptible to sunburns and skin cancer. Dark blue tattoo ink covered the inside of his right biceps, one of his pecs, and the cap of his left shoulder. But sadly, I was too far away to make out the details. I could see that more red hair swept across his chest, trailing into a thin line down the center of his abdomen. His stomach was firm but not flat. Instead of the sharply defined six-packs you saw on fitness magazine covers, his abs were thick bands of solid muscle that protruded slightly around his waist at the navel. Involuntarily, I glided closer to the window, mesmerized by the fierce intensity of his expression, as he sucked in one harsh breath after another. I had to wonder what his face looked like at rest, or even smiling. It was hard to imagine, but I desperately wanted to know. When he finished his set, he turned away to put the dumbbells in a rack along the wall. His shorts tonight were loose and black instead of gray and clingy, which didn't afford nearly as good a view of his glorious backside. Disappointing. He stooped to retrieve a bottle of water off the floor and tipped his head back to chug several long swallows. After wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he turned to gaze out the open door of his garage into the darkness, giving me my first look at his natural expression. His face was far less intimidating than I'd initially supposed. In fact, I'd go so far as to call it friendly. There was an inviting openness to his expression, even as he was still catching his breath from his last exercise set. Something about his wide, shapely lips and the lines around his eyes suggested someone who smiled a lot. I found myself drifting still closer as I tried to imagine what one of his smiles would look like. It seemed a shame he was out there all alone with nothing to smile at. His head turned slightly, and his eyes seemed to focus on my window. I froze where I stood, afraid to move for fear of drawing attention to myself. Could he see me standing here in the dark kitchen? I dearly hoped the reflections on the outside of the glass were enough to hide me from his view. I held my breath as his gaze lingered. It felt like he was looking right at me, but his expression didn't change. Surely if he'd seen me, he would have reacted somehow? Frowned or squinted or something at the sight of someone spying on him in the dark? When he finally turned away, I stumbled out of the kitchen, clutching the door frame as I released a ragged breath. My heart was in my throat, and my chest was heaving almost as hard as his had been after he'd finished his curls. Had he seen me? He hadn't, had he? No, of course not. He couldn't have. It took me a long time to fall asleep after the adrenaline surge of nearly being caught. When I finally did, I was visited once again by intensely sexual dreams in which my athletic neighbor played a starring role. At 8:45 on Monday morning, I strode into the corporate headquarters of King's Creamery wearing my traditional first-day-on-the-job ensemble, an immaculately tailored Alexander McQueen navy pinstripe power suit and comfortable tan pumps, with my platinum blonde hair pulled into a sleek boss babe low pony. The man at the security desk gave me an ID badge and directions to my new office before waving me toward the elevator bank. As I stepped off on the 8th floor and strode past the glass-fronted conference rooms and executive offices, I ignored the curious looks cast in my direction. They had good reason to be curious about the appearance of a stranger in their midst, but they'd learned who I was and why I was here soon enough. Finding my office with no trouble, I unpacked my laptop and stowed my purse away inside my new desk. I was making a last-minute review of my slides when the company's CEO appeared in the doorway of my office, wearing jeans and cowboy boots, with his thinning gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. "You getting settled in all right?" he asked in his gentlemanly Texas twang, as I rose to shake his hand. I'd met George King only once before, over drinks in the bar of the Driscoll Hotel when I'd flown to Austin last month to discuss his company's needs and what I believed I could do for him. The impression I'd drawn from that conversation, as well as the extensive research I'd done on him and his company, was that he was a no-nonsense businessman with a razor-sharp edge lurking beneath his good old boy manners and deceptively casual style. "Perfectly," I answered. "Is everyone in the conference room?" "They are. Shall we get this show on the road?" Grabbing my laptop, I accompanied him down the hall. "Do they know why I'm here? Have you told them anything yet?" "Not a word. Thought I'd let you do the honors yourself." That was good. It prevented misinformation and panic from spreading through the company before I had a chance to speak to the leadership team myself. When I didn't have to waste time combating people's preconceived ideas, things tended to go more smoothly. There was also an advantage in taking people off guard, so they didn't have a chance to take up a defensive posture ahead of time. All eyes turned our way as George King indicated for me to precede him into the conference room. He'd called a mandatory special senior leadership meeting, which had undoubtedly set off all sorts of alarm bells, and I could read the apprehension on everyone's faces. I could also see many of them drawing their own conclusions about my purpose here, based on the fact that I'd entered the room alongside their CEO. The most perceptive ones were drawing the correct conclusions, and had already figured out what was coming. Thanks to the research I'd done, I was able to put a name and title to every face before me, and knew that several of the EVPs present were the CEO's children. King's Creamery was a family-owned business that had been founded by George King's grandfather in 1921. but it was George's leadership over the last 30 years that had grown it from a modest regional ice cream company to the second best-selling brand nationwide. "Good to see everyone made it," George said, as he cast an appraising eye over his assembled leadership team. He gestured at me as I strode to the front of the room and plugged my laptop in to project my slides onto the screen. "This is Maggie Silvestri. I brought her in to take a look at our numbers." Having delivered his brusque introduction, he claimed a chair at the back of the room and casually propped a cowboy-booted ankle on his knee. "Good morning," I said, straightening to address the people seated around the table before me. I wasn't a small woman, and people often found my height intimidating, something I used to my advantage in situations like this. "I'm Maggie, and as George said, I'm here to assess the company's financial health." I paused for a beat to let that sink in before dropping the next bomb. "Today I'm going to show you that if you keep doing the same things you're doing now, King's Creamery will not exist in 5 years."